All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for logging in and listening to our Ask a Therapist soundbite today. Today we have Kelsey, who's a clinician at our practice, and I'll let her introduce herself and the questions she's going to address today.
Yeah, hey everyone. So yes, my name is KelseySchroeder. I'm a psychologist here at Room to Breathe. Thanks for meeting with me, Ramya. I'm really excited.
Yeah, of course.
Um, so the question I brought into the space is, what if I don't have anything to talk about in therapy? Which
Mm,
is something that I hear pretty consistently across the board, like from clients at times, from colleagues, and their
yep.
experience with clients. And then also, I think it's a conversation that's coming up a little bit more like on social media. Like I'm seeing it more on Therapy Talk, on Instagram,
Hmm.
those kind of things. And I thought it'd be a little bit maybe helpful or useful to discuss like what happens with this and like what can we do with this question that is so human and valid.
Yeah.
So the first part of what I like to tell clients, and also what I've discussed with colleagues, as I'm sure you know, we've discussed these kinds of questions consistently in shared spaces, is
Hmm.
the importance of still showing up and getting curious with the question. So I think so
Yeah.
often what can happen is this kind of question or maybe fear that gets brought up with it or concern. It's like, well, what if I don't think to talk about like, what am I going to use that space for? What do I use the hour that's mine for? And I think so
Yeah.
often it can really deter clients from showing up in the space, or they can feel really anxious, like, well, what do I need to bring? Like it is my responsibility to bring the things into this space, which is true. And also,
Hmm.
it's okay to not know and still show up and get curious with the question because we can still
Hmm.
work with the feelings that are brought up with that question.
Hmm.
I also think the second part of that that's so important to follow up with, just showing up and getting curious with it, is taking a moment to breathe and consider what has been taking up emotional space for you that week. And this
Yes.
can truly be anything. When we talk about there can be a space to explore anything that comes up, it is also okay to be like, I haven't had a lot of time or energy or bandwidth this week to look at what's happening in my life. Or there's just certain weeks where there's less things that are requiring our attention and space, or like
Hmm.
there's less things that are on fire. And it can be okay to be like, I need to take a moment to start today because I haven't considered, I've had a hard time figuring out like, what it is I want to use this space for. Can we just take kind of data points? It's like, what's taking up emotional space for me this week? Or like, what have I been
Hmm.
doing to take care of myself?
Yeah. Um, I think sometimes when people ask me this, or they're like, well, I don't really have anything to talk about, it could also be useful to think about themes that we've talked about in the past, right? Like,
Mhm.
there's not always quote unquote fires to put out or problems to address, and that's okay. There doesn't have to be. We can still do long-term work and understand other themes and patterns and stuff like that that we've been um, discussing with our therapists.
Absolutely. I think too, to your point, like sometimes if we feel like we're getting kind of lost in the ether or if it's getting too abstract, we always can
Hmm.
tie to the concreteness of our treatment goals. Of like, well,
Yeah,
we named these things when we first started meeting together. Do those things feel relevant right now? Do those things still
yeah.
feel as useful as important? Or is there something that we don't get to tackle? To your point of like, we can always get curious about like what doesn't get attended to and we're often putting out other fires.
Hmm.
There are things
Hmm.
that take up space, things that we think about late at night sometimes, that we talk about with our friends randomly, right? Like there's often
Oh,
something that
totally.
is sitting, but it just may often get shelved if because other things might just require more attention and effort, or to your point, like if we have to just put out other fires. But then there's space
Yeah,
to look like or think about like if the water is still, we can also see a little bit deeper. And sometimes those are the weeks that if we allow ourselves to be in the moment and again like get curious,
yeah,
things that we didn't expect to come up do, and it can offer a lot of insight or data points of other things that be again like don't necessarily get to be seen and heard in the same way when other things in life are getting prioritized.
yeah, for sure. Um, I think it could also be a common misconception that you only show up to therapy when there's problems to attend,
Mm,
but it can also, be maintenance. Maybe you don't meet as often. Maybe you're not meeting every week or twice a week or whatever it is, but it can be maintenance and it can be like going to the gym, right? Or like moving your body. We don't do those things only when there's something that we need to heal. We do those to be proactive. Or the same as like if you're getting your yearly checkup at the medical doctor's office, you don't go in just because there's a problem or a concern. You go in just for a tune-up. And so
Mm.
those, I think sometimes that gets lost in translation too, of like, well, I don't have anything to talk about, so I'm not going to come today, or I'm just going to do a 10-minute check-in with my therapist. Well, like, no, like what else is happening in life and how can we tune up other areas? And like you said, just get curious about what else is happening when there's not necessarily a concern or a problem, right?
Absolutely. When I think to your point too, there's a difference between it happening kind of randomly or kind of sporadically, as opposed to like it feels like it's a consistent theme, but both deserve the space to be explored, right? I think often if it
Yep.
becomes a consistent theme, then it is worth thinking about like, okay, like are you actually just doing or implementing a lot of the therapy work outside of session? Like that can be actually a really great meaning marker
Mm-hmm.
of, to your point, like the maintenance of it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
or if it feels like it's maybe more sporadic or random, it can be like, okay, yeah, like, so this session's gonna look a little bit different. That's also okay too, because there's no right way to do therapy. There's no even session to session where you
Exactly.
maybe have something that is really top of mind for you to discuss. Those sessions aren't gonna look the same either.
Yep.
Um, and it can often offer some consideration too of like, yeah, if you don't know, like what happens somatically then? And we live in a culture and a
Yeah.
society where we're always demanded to know exactly what's happening next, what we're going to be doing, right? Like there's all these expectations and narratives around what's deemed quote unquote competent or is
Mm-hmm.
competency, or we have
Mm-hmm.
to have such great insight to be self-actualized. I mean, like that's never a constant state of being.
Right.
And then it's also the ability to kind of look a little bit deeper emotionally and somatically, like, well, what happens when you don't know? What happens
Mm-hmm.
when there are these moments of pause where you're like, I'm actually not sure what comes next? Can we tie that into
Mm-hmm.
some existential anxiety about like ambiguity, which all humans experience? Can we
Mm-hmm.
look at the meaning that you make or how you feel about yourself when you don't know what to bring in, right? Like there's all these
Yeah.
kind of different avenues and routes we can start pulling up that can be really both informative, but I also think can be really caring to ourselves.
Yes.
That can
Yeah.
also be then templated to other spaces in life when we don't know the answer. And that doesn't have to be immediately fixed. It can simply be attended to and cared for.
Right. Um, I had a thought and I lost it. That's all right. You can keep going.
Sure, sure. Well, I think too, to kind of expand a little bit more on that, I think so often as well, when people feel like they don't know what to talk about or how to use this space, there could also be some data of like, how have you been told therapy is supposed to be used? Right?
Mm,
Especially because so much of therapy before people come in and like get to explore and experience it, such a beautiful thing, right? Is
hmm.
how we discuss it socially or culturally, or like what we see in social media and pop culture, those kind of things. And to your
Yeah.
point, I think so often we see it being kind of this really deep psychoanalytic work, talking about like the core roots of relationships or
Hmm.
attachment. And not that those things don't absolutely deserve space, but I
Right. It
think that
can be that. It's just not
absolutely.
always that.
And it doesn't have to be that, right? Like
Right.
it can
Right.
also be anything that feels useful or supportive. And sometimes what's supportive is just being like, I'm not sure. I just need to be present in this moment. And can I
Hmm.
do that with somebody else, aka my therapist, um, and allow it to be maybe a little bit uncomfortable, but not intolerable?
Yep.
Or can it be manageable
Yeah.
in the discomfort? And can I see how that shows up in other areas of my life too? Because therapy is the microcosm, right? Like
Yep.
it's very, very rare that anything is occurring in therapy that hasn't occurred or isn't occurring somewhere else in your life.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I remember what I was going to say now, tying
Oh
back
yeah.
to your point about like the somatics and understanding that about like the mind body connection and how
Mm,
if we don't have anything pressing to talk about in therapy, about how we can use that space to kind of tap back into our body. And that's a wonderful place. I don't know about you, Kelsey, but that for me, that's a wonderful place to introduce meditation or some grounding
mhm.
work and trying to figure out what is happening in our bodies. Because, like you said, I think we're taught to kind of just move on to the next thing and just to go, 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 but we don't have space to really just sit in our bodies and our mind and think about what's happening and how that feels and
Mhm.
what that means and how we are assigning meaning to those things.
1000%. To your
Yeah.
point too, it's interesting to think about the opportunity that would actually offer for such mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and how I think there's this belief of like if therapy again like isn't used one certain way, it's considered like a not a useful space, which isn't true.
Right.
There's no missed
Right.
opportunities in therapy. Like we could always circle back
Yep.
and or we could always attend to something new that's coming up. And in the mind body connection too, when people, I think, both in terms of, I say this as a therapist and also as a client in therapy, when people show up or don't know what to talk about that week, it can easily kind of transition or click into like an intellectualizing process of it. Of
Mhm.
like, okay, now I'm going to be thinking about like all the things that have happened this week, or I'm thinking about how I want to show up or how I want to present, or now because I feel anxious or fearful or concerned, I'm going to tap into some impression management, which again, so human,
Mhm.
but being able to kind of drop into the body also
Yep.
helps kind of get us out of that cycle of intellectualizing away something that is uncomfortable and looking at like what answers is my body holding and what
Mhm.
else could be explored or tapped into or connected with that maybe wouldn't have if we always think every week about this is exactly the thing I want to talk about this week and this is exactly how I want to talk about it because
Mhm.
there's still an openness to looking at like well what's coming up and how can we kind of work with that uh,
Mhm.
and also like how are we letting your body lead us in some direction too.
Yeah, totally. And that awareness is not something that we're innately taught. Um, or maybe isn't even really valued all that much in other spaces, which is probably a whole other segment that we could do, honestly.
Absolutely. We'll pin that one. We'll pin that
Yeah,
one.
next time we'll do another one. As we wrap up here, if there was one thing that you want listeners to take away from our, conversation today, what would it be?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say maybe two things. The
Mm-hmm.
first being to just like really normalize and validate the question and concern about like what if I don't have anything to talk about in therapy? Like what do I do with that? And the
Mm-hmm.
second being like that is okay, still show up. In the same way that we encourage clients to show up however they are, however they're doing, what's ever happening in their life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that is an okay way to show up and it's an okay thing to process and discuss out loud. And it's not taboo. You're not doing therapy wrong. Just
Mm-hmm.
show up and get curious.
Yeah, I love that. Um, okay. Were you able to get through everything that you wanted to get through? Anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, no, I think that encapsulates pretty much all of it.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Kelsey. Listeners, I hope you're able to take something away from it and make sure if you have any other burning questions or follow-up feedback that you um, message us on Instagram or look us up on our website. And we have tons of services that we offer. So hopefully you guys are interested in some things and you can follow us there. Thanks again, Kelsey. I always enjoy our conversations together.
Oh, me too. Thank you, Rami. I appreciate the
Yeah,
space.
of course.